Hi, everyone. Hello, how are you guys doing? Awake? Yay! Hi. Unlike what it says in the program, I'm not Dan Cook. Observe the pigtails. I'm a new faculty member here at the NYU Game Center. Yeah! It's amazing the energy that we have in the afternoon. I'm Spanish, this is siesta time, and the energy in the room is amazing. I'm really excited about this panel. My focus is on narrative games, is what I study and I make. And I'm really, really happy to have a panel that focuses specifically on narrative today. We've seen this morning a lot of discussion about designing choice, how difficult it is to integrate choices and giving players different choices and consequences, in general in narrative games, in strategy games. And I wanted to focus specifically on how difficult it is when we are trying to bring together a story, or whose story we don't know, the player, the characters, along with a series of choices. Bringing narrative and games together through choices is really, really hard. And we have here three of the people who have done an amazing job with different games, and I wanted to know more about the nitty-gritty of each one of them. So we're going to have Emily Short, who is creative director of Linden Labs. She's been working on conversation systems and interactive narrative for a long, long time. She's going to be talking about the system Versu, which is a system that has been used for different individual games. And then we have Sean Vanaman and Jay Rodkin, who are going to be talking about The Walking Dead, which has come up several times this morning too. They are, first of all, co-founders of Idle Thumbs. And also, they were co-creative leads of Walking Dead, but now they have founded their own company, Camposanto Games. All right, so let's get started. Emily, please. Round of applause.
Yes, I'll have the microphone. Okay. Yeah, sorry. Slightly. Your key. Take out both computers. All right. So I'm Emily Short. Clara kindly referred to me as the creative director of Linden Lab, but that makes it sound like I'm the boss of more than I actually am. I'm a creative director at Linden Lab, and there are lots of other projects that other people are doing that I do not direct and control. They're not all my minions. It's just the Versu project. So what is this? Can everybody hear me? This feels sort of only half on. Okay, good. So Versu is a project which is based in character AI. In particular, having characters that have autonomy, that have an idea of the social situation that they're in, that are going to be sort of simulating how they feel about other people, how they respond to other people, what relationships they want to be in. So I tend to talk about this as sort of shorthand by calling it social physics. Instead of having models of crates and explosives and water, like Warren was telling us to model, we're modeling angry people, shy people, people who are trying to get a date with each other, all of those kinds of things. And we're presenting this in text. And there are several reasons for doing that, partly just because as a kind of starting point for this kind of technology, we're already being so ambitious about what we're trying to do with the simulation that in sort of going beyond that and saying, okay, we're going to simulate characters that have these different desires and different nuanced wishes about what they're going to do and feelings about one another. And then on top of that, we're also going to layer procedurally generated animation that expresses all of that complexity through their faces. It was just way more than we were ready to take on. So instead we are doing this as interactive fiction, but interactive fiction where the characters really move around and they're really the center of the story. So if you're sort of acquainted with interactive fiction in the sense of parser games and the legacy of Infocom, I love those things, but that's not exactly what this is. It's not about sort of unlocking doors. Instead, it's text that's constantly moving forward. Characters are constantly making choices and responding to you and doing things based on what you've done in the room in their presence. So that's obviously sort of, well, it's obviously to me, that is a cool and exciting thing to do from a technological point of view. But what I find aesthetically appealing about it is that it makes it possible to try to capture a kind of interpersonal play that I've been interested in for a really long time. Something that somebody said to me about one of the first games that I ever wrote, Galatea, was that it was the first time that they had ever been playing a game and said something to an NPC, and the NPC was so hurt that they spontaneously wanted to apologize to her. And I have ever since then thought, yeah, that's a really great measure of what it is that I'm trying to do. I want to create characters who are sufficiently believable in their reactions to your action, your treatment of them, that you're inspired to interact with them in ways that kind of go beyond the normal expectations of video games. And I want to represent that not only through sort of large-scale choices like, am I going to push this person off a cliff or not? Am I going to save this person or not? But also at the level of small-scale moments when you're sort of, I'm in a room with this person, I kind of like them, but they're clearly frightened and upset, so I'm going to reach over and touch their hand to calm them down a little bit. I want to have those kinds of elements as a possibility in the game, as well as the large-scale choices. So that's what the Versu system is designed to do. Now, how well does that work out in practice? Well, this is a sort of demonstration or a in-progress screenshot from a project that we're still writing. But the reason that I put this up here is that it shows you an episode set up where you're allowed to pick which characters are going into it. In fact, in this case, there's only one character that you can play. But in some Versu stories, you're allowed to pick from several characters. You're allowed to select somebody. So characters have their own definitions that are separate from the definition of the episode as a whole. So one way to think about this is that the sort of characters are defined in a way that give them personal capacities. Like some characters might be shy, some characters might be very flirtatious, and it's easier for them to start relationships with other characters, all of this kind of thing. So as we've experimented with this, there are all sorts of ways that this process can completely explode and be horrible. And one of the sort of back and forth experience that I had over and over and over again during early phases of Versu development was that somebody would say, hey, you know what would be really cool to add to the simulation? Something where if you make somebody really angry, then they get so upset with you that they storm out of the room. And then you could use that to sort of solve situations where you're trying to get somebody to go away. Like you could insult them a lot and then they get mad and then they'd be gone. And I think, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Okay, I'll put that into the simulator, get it in there, and then it seems to be working fine. Go to QA. QA is like, okay, you know, during the first scene where you're finding out what you're supposed to do and you're basically, I mean, it's not exactly a quest, but you're being given instructions about where this is supposed to go. Well, my boss got mad and stormed out of the room before he got done telling me what to do, and therefore we didn't get anywhere. And so the story was broken. And so then we sort of turn off the more extreme part of the simulator again in order to make up for, you know, having it be broken that way. So this is an example in the sort of Roman political intrigue that I'm working on right now, where the simulation was so sort of entertainingly aggressive that I had a couple of NPCs who had developed a dislike of one another and had gone into another room from where the player character was, and one of them actually, like the fight escalated and one of them got stabbed and people started freaking out about this murder that had happened in the next room, which I, the player, wasn't involved in and which was not intended to be a part of this plot in any way. So the first challenge that we really needed to solve in order to do anything with this was exert some sort of parameters on what the simulation is allowed to do when. Because obviously, if you have a simulation, but the simulation is never allowed to generate any extreme outcomes, then that's not very satisfying from the point of view of the player feeling a lot of agency. Like if I've got a character and every time I poke the character, he says, hey, the first couple times you're like, hey, this is cool, like he's reacting to me, but then if you never get to a point where he reacts strongly, you feel like that simulation's not very exciting. But on the other hand, you need to be careful about when those strong reactions are allowed to happen. So one of the major things that we had to do was really kind of break the narrative down into scenes and look at them as though these scenes are almost like level design. And in a given individual scene, you need to put some constraints on what is allowed to happen in that scene. So now as we build these things, we can do things like say, okay, during this scene, characters can wander around, during that scene, they can't. During this scene, somebody could die. During that scene, they can have sex. During this other scene, you know, but not all the time. And so that puts some sort of boundaries around what the simulation is producing that makes it a little bit easier. So that was an improvement. We get a couple of slightly subtler kinds of problems. It's a failure if the simulation is not affecting the narrative in any interesting way. So say we've got a scene opening, your boss starts assigning you a task to do. As part of the simulation, it comes out of the simulation that you're playing this really pugnacious character right now. Your boss annoys you, you annoy him, you punch him in the face, and then like the scene timer runs out and says, okay, you know, good job, I'll see you later, shakes your hand, and you leave. Like, that's not very satisfying either, right? And you feel like, well, we've got the simulation allowed me to do something entertaining and funny, but the story completely failed to notice that happening in any interesting way. So that's totally unsatisfying. So what do we do about that? The thing to do about this essentially is say, we need to be really cautious when we are putting those parameters on what the simulation is allowed to do during a particular scene, and say, if I'm allowing the following outcomes to happen, then I also need there to be some kind of narrative level reward for getting to that world state. I don't have to know how we got to that world state. It doesn't matter whether my boss is mad at me because I said something really inappropriate or like I was physically aggressive or whatever. But if you're going to allow the simulation to go there, then you need to make sure that you've written the narrative in a way that's going to acknowledge that. So, an example of how, excuse me, of how some of this works in the story that I've been working on most recently is this Roman political intrigue. The background of the story is you are a poet and you are the client of this wealthy patron who is a general. And after a little bit of sort of introductory wining and dining, the general turns to you and he tells you he has this job for you to do, which is that he wants you to go and consult an important oracle. And he tells you that what he wants you to ask is whether you could overthrow the emperor, or whether he could overthrow the emperor and rule in the emperor's place. And obviously this is a very politically risky thing for you to go off and do because there are spies everywhere, and being heard asking this kind of question could get you into a lot of trouble. So we have some hand-authored responses to that kind of thing with these conversation options where you can be a total toady and say, why, yes, I would love to do whatever you want me to do, that's fine. You could say, there's no chance that I would do that, no way. You can take a kind of a middle road. You can try and steer the question away from the question of your compliance at all. All of those are options that are sort of authored level content to reply to that situation. But they're authored level content that is also affecting the simulation. So if, for instance, you say, yes, I'm super loyal, I'd love to do whatever you want, that is going to change his sort of opinion meters about you and what he thinks about what kind of guy you are. So say that I decide that I am pretty risk averse and I choose the option to totally refuse to do this. And so he's got this authored response to say, you you can't really get away with refusing. I didn't really ask, I'm telling. And at this point, what's happened is we've sort of switched off actually from, he's got that authored response, but then we've also moved into some of the simulator generated responses where he's doing some minor actions that kind of calm down his own mood. He's confronted you about something that he doesn't like about what you're doing. You have the opportunity to apologize, and this is coming out of the simulator rather than out of me having handwritten every single piece of this. You apologize to him, he says you're forgiven, and so now we've gotten partly through the action of the simulator, we've gotten back to a point in this narrative scene where things are basically okay between you and him. But it's also possible for you to kind of refuse to be responsive to that and to kind of push back on him. And if that happens and he doesn't get back to where he trusts you within a reasonable amount of time, then he decides that he actually can't take the risk of having you do this really dangerous thing, and he has you killed, and there you are, you're done. So not all of the possible outcomes are necessarily that fatal, but the idea is essentially to kind of have scenes in which the narrative is setting the ball rolling, it's getting things going, then the simulator makes it possible for the player to kind of choose a course through that scene. What kind of ending do they want to have? What kind of relationship do they want to have with the other characters by the time that ends? So the other major sort of mode of failure that we run into is conversely where the narrative doesn't affect the simulation very satisfyingly. So in one of our earlier stories, which was a sort of modern office comedy kind of story, we had a character who's kind of this frat boy player character who goes around hitting on people all the time. And there's a story beat that can happen where he gets dramatically rejected in a way that forces him to kind of re-examine how he's treating people, right? And this is like a narrative thing that can happen. But one of the problems was that could get into a state where his hitting on people verbs hadn't gone away and they hadn't changed. So if you were playing as him, you'd have this sort of narrative revelation about how to treat people, but then you would still go around doing the same things you'd ever been doing before. So an example of how we try to address this in the story that I'm currently working on, one of the things that the simulation does, because it is tracking things like character preferences about kinds of things to value, kinds of things to care about. Do I care about intelligence, attractiveness? Am I going to do things that signal those values strongly? There's a lot of coding attached to all of the verbs that are available in the game to kind of indicate what kind of person would do this under what circumstances, how would they feel about it. And that allows us to kind of turn things on and off. So a little bit later in this story, you've gone along to consult this oracle, and you meet the priestess who is going to take you through the consultation. And she's actually somebody that you had tried to hook up with in the past, but she rejected you and went off to this temple instead. But she remembers that in her previous acquaintance with you, you were very much kind of an impious, unbelieving kind of guy. And so she can confront you about that. So now you've got the opportunity to respond to that, and there's sort of a range of sort of colorations of, are you going to apologize? Are you going to apologize in a way that doesn't really make things better? But because she specifically called you out for not being pious enough, one of the things that you can do in response to her treatment of you is say, you know what, actually, I probably should be more pious. Like, that would be a good thing for me. And when you do that, the character definition of your character is altered in that moment. And this, again, is something that's coming out of the simulator, but it's based in this sort of narrative moment. And this allows the player to decide to kind of, I'm gonna make this be partly a story about a guy who has this important encounter, and it makes him decide that he's going to take the gods more seriously. Like, that's what my version of the story is going to be like. And as a result of that, the simulator says, okay, I'm now going to add some additional sort of pious things for you to be able to do during this scene. You can interact with the statue of the goddess in ways that weren't previously available to you. So this is a little bit sketchy because it's the dev version and it's got some dev bits in it. But it's opened up these new avenues for you as a result of this narrative moment that create new possibilities for how you're going to interact with people in the future. So the sort of overarching thing that I'm trying to get at here is that I think it's really important to do simulation that deals with not just sort of physical objects, but with emotional encounters with people. Because if we want to tell stories about people and we want simulation to contribute to those stories about people, we need the simulation to be addressing the aspects that are actually relevant to, either the character's interiority, how do I think about things, how do I feel about things. There are choices in Versu where you're just remembering something, or as in this example, you're changing your mind internally about the kind of person you want to be. But there are also inevitably a lot of sort of interesting challenges that arise from suturing the simulation and the narrative together in a satisfying and convincing way. So that's what we're working on. It doesn't have an official title yet, but it will look something like that. And it will be in the App Store in a little while. And I'm not allowed to say any dates. If you want to talk to me about any of that, that's where I can be found. And now I think it's your guys' turn.
Is this working? Yeah, okay. This and that guy. Good. There's going to be one more of those. Nope, never mind. So yeah, we're going to actually show a little video at one point, not at the beginning, but also there are some swears in this. Everybody's an adult here, but we're not all Brad Muir, potty mouth Muir up there. Oh, you're going to hit play?
I'm going to hit play. I think.
Cool. Okay, yeah, so hi, I'm Sean Vanaman.
I'm Jake Rodkin. Hello.
Yeah, we just started a company called Campo Santo, working with some friends on a video game. We're not going to talk too much about that, but maybe at the Q&A.
Maybe accidentally.
Maybe accidentally. Yeah, what we're going to talk about is going to be pretty condensed. So if you haven't played The Walking Dead, it's an adventure game. That's all I know.
Yeah. But also, we're probably going to spoil the crap out of it. So if
that's
something
yeah,
you're concerned about, I'm sorry.
You should go get a biscotti or whatever. But it occurred to me that we didn't really set up what The Walking Dead is anywhere in this presentation. But yeah, it's an adventure game. You make dialogue choices on a timer. You explore spaces. Sometimes you solve puzzles, but you do a lot of character interaction. And most of that stuff, unlike other adventure games, or like I should say classic adventure games, you are given choices and then oftentimes can't remake them. So choices are less about exposition and more about interaction. But yeah, we can start now.
Yeah. So what we're talking about today is sort of our version through The Walking Dead of our criteria for designing impactful and meaningful choice in a game, especially if you're making a game where choice is the main verb of the game.
Yeah. And again, this is sort of like our criteria. This is just our process. Like, what did we do when it comes to what are we going to put on the screen?
I would say it's the best one, though, probably.
Yeah, it's totally the only one you should do. So, yeah, but it's worth it. It's kind of talking about, or at least thinking about for a second, like, what is even the purpose of narrative choice in a game? You know, there are a lot of games that are really great. I can think of one like Half-Life where you don't really have any choices. Obviously combat choices. I'm not going to say those aren't important, but you're going straight. So it's worth exploring, like, why do it? Because it's not free. Obviously, there's like marketing, because you get to say to the public, you get to say to a person, you get to choose what happens, and that's really intoxicating to hear. You choose. You are the one, and that's great. But so that can come from the top down. You can be told you're making a game about choice. If
So that there's a sick
you ever
bullet
work
point on your
at
box.
a developer or a publisher and they say that to you, that's what's happening. Yeah, and there can be a sweet back-of-the-box bullet. But then also there's the idea of empowerment, right? People say, oh, we're going to let players choose because it's so powerful. Like, you're going to be in this, like, you're going to be the person who crafts what happens in this world. And I think as an industry, we have this sort of, like, perverse obsession in game design with making sure the player is empowered and feels powerful. We don't really buy into that a ton. Like, you can go play a game on God mode, or like, if you really want to be super powerful, I guess.
Yeah, I think we would say that choice is in there for player agency, and I think you could say, I think it's potentially possible to conflate the notion of player agency with the notion of player empowerment, and I don't think that those are the same. I think that a player being able to feed back into the game is not the same as the game granting the exact wishes of that feedback. I want to talk closer to the mic so you can hear me. It's not putting the player in control of the game, but it's making sure they can express what do they want and how do they feel about what's going on in the game.
So yeah, the crux of what we're talking about is what makes this well-designed choice, because that's all we have as a verb, as we said at the beginning. So we kind of have to be obsessed with every single detail about whether it's a narrative choice, like go left or go right, or save this person or save this person's life, or just dialogue choices. And I think a lot of these principles can be applied to both, but when putting the presentation together, I often found myself thinking along the dialogue route, but
yeah,
you'll see.
There's sort of two things to say about this actually before you go. One is, when we're talking about what makes a well-designed choice, this is kind of a mix of ideological stuff and practical stuff, just because this is what makes a well-designed choice inside of an adventure game that you have, or a narrative-based game that you are responsible for producing as a human being with human beings and dollars. And then the other thing is that, yeah, this talk might secretly just be our dissertation on dialogue trees, but whatever.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess the first thing is a choice allows the player to express him or herself in the game, as opposed to like shooting, running, jumping, things like this. It's how the player is actually communicating back into the game things that they want or things that they feel. And then you pay attention to what the player has expressed. So choices have to have like breadth, but not at the expense of what the character could do. And that's always really challenging, right? So like, everybody always wants to say like, why couldn't I just punch that guy? And for the type of games that we're interested in making, which are games about people, specific people, in the hopes of like fostering like a grain of empathy for what it's like to be somebody else, that person may not have that capacity to do that in their soul, and that's okay.
Yeah, at a certain point, asking why can't I punch that guy in the face is like asking why couldn't that guy fly into space right now? Just
Yeah,
he's just not capable.
Like I could ask somebody in the front row right now, like punch me in the face as hard as you can, and maybe if it was Zimmerman, we'd be on board. But most people would not have it in them. So number two is it has to fit within production scope. So we're going to talk briefly about that at the end, and just a little bit about our thought process about that, because of the way when you make content-driven games, you're oftentimes generating content along like before other stuff's coming online, whether it's art assets or sometimes tools, not so much at Telltale because the tool set's really codified there. So you have to be smart as a designer who is, when you know you have like 15 artists behind you, we're gonna have to make the AV come out of the screen. And then the last one, which is sort of ambiguous, and this is like, I know like a crunchy, like everybody's talking about very practical design principles here, but it has to entertain and enlighten and teach or surprise the player. Like it has to. Like that's why the person is playing the game. The comment was made earlier about like in 5 minutes you have to like really value that person's time. And I think the same thing goes for a choice in a video game.
So yeah, we're going to talk about the... You son of a bitch.
I'm sorry.
That was a screenshot from Monkey Island. We're going to talk about the third thing first, which is choices that entertain, delight, and surprise. In a game about choice, the choice's ability to surprise and delight you is the game. Like it's choices which aren't fun in the moment is like making a shooter where the guns suck. You know, like if so,
Yeah, like if you went to a playtest and you're like, oh, I just didn't feel good to like, jump. Like that's the equivalent for a choice that doesn't feel compelling even, and fun's not even the right word, but fulfilling to make.
Yeah, this is kind of a slight like shift off to the side of that a little bit, but Telltale is a company that is very much obviously of like a direct descendant of the LucasArts adventure game stuff. I also really I got into the games industry because I played Monkey Island as a kid. But when we started working on The Walking Dead, we looked actually a lot at Monkey Island 1, sometimes more than at Telltale's other games, actually, because the thing that people often remember about Monkey Island is different than the thing that actually makes you complete Monkey Island. Like the dialogue, the most entertaining stuff in Monkey Island, actually the stuff that I think does the weird thing where you as a player are telling your friend about your adventure game playthrough the way that someone talks about Dishonored, is when you get to the dialogue that you get to say, not the dialogue that you have to say. Like the stuff in Monkey Island that people talk about, and in like the best adventure games of the classic stuff, is you're like, oh, then this guy showed up and I got to call him Cannonball Head, and then he was fucking pissed, and then I said, I'm sorry I called you Cannonball Head. What I meant to call you was Chrome Dome, and then he got super fucking pissed. But in those old adventure games, those were basically the flavor that were designed to make it feel like there was a lot you could do, but it would always loop you back around and to the point that you finally had to say, okay, what are the 3 things that I need to do to make you go away and, give me the next cutscene. But looking back at the sort of what do you get to do versus what do you have to do was a thing that we tried hard to make a game where the stuff that you had to do went away, but it was still a game.
Yeah, like that was like a huge revelation. Even as like, so I do the bulk of the actual like line by line writing, even though we like co-write together. That's like a revelation when you realize that as a designer or writer, when you're like, okay, I have these empty slots. I know the context of the situation that we're about to enter into. What would just be the most delicious thing to give the player? And then you have to think of 3 more, so not everybody picks the top one. But so I want to talk a little bit about how that was applied to The Walking Dead, which seems sort of like a weird departure. Don't click forward yet.
I won't click it.
Okay. But yeah, so the design of the game is just going to come through actually in the writing on a game like this. And so in the scene we're actually going to show a clip. It's from the second episode. Lee and his crew, Lee's the protagonist, he's taking care of this little girl named Clementine. That's all you got to know. There were zombies, not in the scene. But they have been taken in by some like country folk who are secretly like taking in groups like Lee's to chop them up and turn them into meat, which is gross. It's so funny because when you design this stuff in a vacuum with a bunch of other people, you're like, oh yeah, of course they're cannibals and they're gonna eat the guy's legs, no big deal. And then you tell it to like rational, like even-keeled, smart people, and you're like, oh, it's really gross. Fucking video games. So you get to make a choice. Okay, so yeah, and then you get to make a choice in this scene towards a character who has been. If you could walk all the way up to being completely like overtly racist to somebody, that is what this guy has been to Lee. And people on the forums didn't really like him. And this is in the second episode, so we'd given you an episode and a half to build a relationship with this guy. Will it go? Or do I have to hit?
I don't know how to make it work.
Lee, Jesus, man. Did you find something? Oh, sit your ass down, Lee. This lady has made you a meal.
Yeah, Lee, what's gotten into you?
He just had a start.
He could use some goddamn manners.
This woman right here is fucking insane!
This woman made you a home-cooked meal, you ungrateful shit. Show some respect.
Thank you, Larry.
You don't even have the decency to take a handout when you're offered one. It just makes me sick. It really does.
That's enough, Larry.
Ken, maybe we should...
Hang on, Cat. Just keep Doug close.
You know what? Fuck you, Larry. Eat up.
I will, and I'll enjoy every last bite.
Lee, what the hell is wrong with you?
So yeah, like that's a fun thing to make that guy do, I think. I don't know. But again, like having that wasn't even in the design, but you sit down with the we have these principles of how we're going to design things in the game. You sit down to actually do it, and then you instantly like jump up and you go to the team and you go, okay, can he do this? Because if you think about it, that's like the thing you want to do the most right there. So yeah. And it's important to also know that these choices actually illuminate things about the character who could say them. Because what the character is capable of is really, really important to developing that character in the story. So like what characters like can say, not just what they do say, tells us a lot about them. And we experimented a lot with this in the game. There's a point in the beginning, at the very beginning in the first scene, when Lee is asked by a police officer something about like his crime, and you can, I think you can just say like, "Fuck you, old man," or something like that. And then you can select it, but then Lee like goes to say it and chooses against it. And people hated it, but it was an experiment that I think I needed to see in practice, because we were always kind of toying with this thing. Like every time you put something in a dialogue tree, it's in Lee's soul to communicate it. And later it actually worked out really well because he was physically stopped from saying it. He like calls out to Clementine. He's like, "Clementine, I'm here, don't worry." But he's at gunpoint and a guy just like stops him. And it worked really well then. And those are just sort of like things we learned along the way.
So let's see. That slide sounds really intense when I see it up here, but that's fine. I think within the constraints of the character you're playing, choice becomes player expression, which is exactly what it says there. So players, okay. Sorry. I know. I you just distracted me from what I was going to say. It's okay. Shit on a stick. I think it's. Hi guys, don't mind me. When people are playing The Walking Dead, when they're playing as Lee, it's very true that they have a pretty narrow band of mechanical abilities inside of the game. You basically can press the button that the game tells you to press. But the reasons behind the choices that people make is a thing that we've found is wildly different from player to player. And they get these 4 prompts and they use them in a way that's very different from how people use dialogue in a traditional game. I guess when I go back to the stuff that I was saying about Monkey Island and the getting to stuff versus having to stuff, when the game, in most dialogue tree, like when you think of a dialogue tree and you sort of poo-poo it, in my opinion, or dialogue trees are a thing people like to poo-poo. It's because they're usually looked at as a shitty version of like a logic maze that you have to get through to get to the end. Whereas dialogue in The Walking Dead goes the opposite direction when at its best. There's stuff in the game that is the maze you have to navigate, but when the dialogue in the game is the means by which players get to tell the game what they feel about something, or what the experience meant to them, or how they responded to stimulus from the game poking at them, it ends up feeling like they're making an expressive choice inside of the game in a way that you don't when you're just saying, "Tell me more about, your chicken business," or whatever it is that's in, So an example of that, which is not without its clunkiness, but is at the very, very, very end of the final episode of the game, you finally meet this guy who's kidnapped Clementine, the girl who's with you the entire time, and it turns out that he has sort of become weird, like, telephone buddies with Clementine because they both had walkie-talkies that could talk to each other, and he's been tracking you, and his opinion of you is just complete garbage because he thinks that you've ruined this kid's life. And you get to him, and he's then sort of your save game, I guess. But
yeah, he knows like all the facts about you, but none of the emotional context about you.
And we kind of got to the idea of this being as concrete as it was partway through the project when we realized that this is kind of how people were using dialogue and how this stuff could work. But I've got a clip of it that we can show. Do you have anything else?
No, just like he calls you out on a bunch of stuff, and then we try to create choices that let the player ruminate on the things they've done in the game.
Yeah.
Do I look like a monster to you?
Yes.
If you think that now, you just wait. I'm not like you. You walked a little girl into a dairy full of sick people and let them get their hands on her.
It's more complicated than that.
You abandoned a defenseless, grieving woman.
I wouldn't do that again.
The sweatshirt she's wearing was my boy's. You stole that from us.
I fucked up.
Yes, you did.
So, yeah, as it says on the slide, it gives players the room to determine how they feel and a way to tell it back to the game, which I think is interesting. The Walking Dead, it has choices and it has dialogue, but it deliberately doesn't place a value judgment on any of those things. And
yeah, there's no like light side or dark side.
Yeah,
that didn't really.
If Lee just curses up a storm and doesn't do anything nice to this little girl, like he doesn't get more veiny or anything over the course of the game. Like he just stays as Lee for the duration. And
should have got more veiny. That's really good. In our new game, your character will get more veiny, as you make choices.
A thing that I'm just gonna say a dumb thing, but sorry. The thing that I think is interesting about that is this game is still, The Walking Dead is effectively a corridor that you go down of like bespoke spaces with different encounters in them, and then you as a player determine how you are going to play through those encounters, and the game does not make a value judgment on you at all. It leaves it up to yourself, and that to me actually maps emotionally to when I play through Dishonored and I decide that I'm going to kill people or I'm not, or at this moment I'm going to choke someone out or I'm not. And I'm not saying that they are mechanically the same. I'm not saying that the intent behind those things is the same, because it is fucking not. They're like very different. They're made differently. They mean different things. But I think it's the reason why players do things is a thing that you should be paying attention to, as well as what they can do and how they do it. Anyway.
So yeah, just like really quick, like how does this impact the actual making of your video game? It's something you have to be, like we have this criteria, like the stuff that we already got through before, even though we put them in a different order at the beginning, because you have to be stringent and you have to, like the economy of words and the economy of space is so important, and also just the economy of your production team to actually make the thing. So, because like what you can do, and we did this, right? In episode 2, we decided it'd be a good idea for you to just have a really wide breadth of possibility space. You could decide, oh, I want to go to this place first. I'm going to go to this place. I'm going to meet these people, and they're going to say, come with us, and you can say yes or no. Or you can say, okay, yes, I'll go with you if you give me this, and then they want something from you, and then you can haggle with them, and then if you give them something, and then you have to, it was crazy. Because so basically, you can get to a situation, right, where if you think of every single social interaction that your characters could have, and then you try to produce every possible outcome, you will absolutely go insane. You will go nuts. And then what you will also do is be producing a simulation instead of a story.
That's not quite right. I think you'll produce a simulacrum of a simulation.
Yes.
You will not actually produce a simulation. You will just waste your life trying to create one out of a bunch of fucking bubbles in a flowchart.
Right, which I think is something that, I think that's kind of what Warren was getting at this morning. And that is when choice goes wrong, and I think that's actually what a lot of games are doing wrong when it comes to the implementation of choice within them. You kind of, because you only have so many hours to make the game, and you only have so much energy, you have to sort of employ tricks. Montage effect is what we use everywhere. On the micro level, it's everywhere in the game because you say one of 4 things, and then maybe one of 2 things is said. Oftentimes we get, because this is a licensed game, we were getting into stuff with canon where a character just couldn't be there. There's a character named Glenn in the game who's in the comics and in the show and everywhere, and he needed to be in the game mostly for marketing reasons, to be honest.
Yes, we were told, in fact, that he had to be there.
Don't tweet that.
Whatever.
Yeah.
It's also what you do. It's a spin-off move, whatever.
So he has to go see his friends. He's like, I'm going to have many great adventures now. But it was important for you to have an impact on him, so we let you make 2 important choices that we paid off, with AV, in front of him, and then sign off with him in a way that made you feel like your relationship would carry forward even though you guys weren't going to be together, which is essentially, you have my blessing to leave, or I think you're making a huge mistake. And then you would say those 2 things, and he would come back at you with a bunch of different versions based on the sort of things he had seen you do in the game. But he's leaving either way, so we only had to produce the AV for him getting in the car and driving away once. So, yeah. In conclusion, I guess
don't know if
sort of all of it. Oh, yeah. I guess
we have a montage of
we have a
conclusion.
Yeah, we have a montage effect and conclusion in practice, actually. So, like, for instance, at the end of this talk, right, like, you could, is he going to clap?
politely
Yeah,
clap.
Politely clap. It'd be very nice. Very nice.
Yeah, or you could give us a standing ovation, which would,
No
be
pressure.
nice. You could just walk out. Or you could call bullshit on the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and then, like, if we were to sit up here and cry in response to any 4 of these things, like, there would be 4 very, very different stories. And that's how you could produce that, like, with one outcome. And I think it would mean 4 very, very, very different things. And it's just something to always think about. It means you have to play your game a lot.
I think in the brain of a player, those things, the same art of tears going down our face that our effects supervisor was bummed that we had to pay for, would be worth it, because for 4 possible different things, you could end up having that mean completely different things to different people.
Yes.
Or not. I don't know. Fucking practice. Sweet.
Yeah, that's it. All right.
So
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Can I make black here? I can't.
You make wood.
We'll look at this nice wood grain.
We're in this nice den now.
Hello. Yay.
Hey.
Thank you so much. That was a lot of fun. I'm going to start with one question, and then you guys can ask each other questions, and then we open it up. So what's interesting here is that we have story-driven games, and unlike other types of games, if you have stories, you have to have character. The thing in common of what we're all saying is that we're starting with the character. We're starting with people. We're simulating people. It's not like, objects, physics of world physics, not like, character physics is a fantastic way to put it. So if we want to have stories, we have to have characters. They happen to humans or human-like entities. And part of that kind of overlaps with writing. When you do any storytelling, one of the things that they teach you is, it's all about character and character motivation. Basically, I want to hear a bit more about how writing and game design overlap in your practice, because this is really about a bit of both. You can be a writer and do game design through writing, which is something that I don't think we've really touched in practice before. So anybody want to take that up?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it's important to delineate between story and character, actually, because I think every game, in some sense, has a story in it. I think we were talking about that this morning, and even like the stories that Rob was talking about that people generate in their Risk Legacy playthroughs with their friends are all stories, and those can be devoid of specific character. I think the things that are interesting me in my career right now, at least I think Jake and I together, hopefully, start a company and everything. But our character is the specificity of character. That's something that's very interesting to me personally, and I think we're pursuing games where the writing of the actual character, of the things that character can say, in the way that character that we're asking you to embody can react, is the game design. I think it's so funny when we talk to our friends about what our game is about, the one we're working on, and it's not an easy pitch because of that. It's not like, oh, it's a shooter, oh, it's a puzzle game, it's whatever. It's like, oh no, you're this guy and you're gonna be in this place and you're gonna react to things and then that's gonna be it. And I'm really excited, at least it seems like there's an opportunity to make a game like that. The Walking Dead proved that out. We had some big fights on Walking Dead. There were people who left the project because they were like, this isn't a game. And I was like, well, F you, that happened. That happened on making the game. I don't know what this game is if there's no challenge. And it's like, well, it's the experience of going through it. And if you don't want to call it a game, I don't care what you call it. But it was a thing that we were interested in making. But it was about a specific person. And I think right now, like I said, just to reiterate, and this is a really long answer, is just that's what I'm personally curious about. How much can we ask you to carry the very specific rocks in somebody's backpack? How far will a game allow you to get when you are talking about imagining being somebody else, like in their shoes. That's just something I think is cool. So that is character focused, and that it also means it has a story in the traditional sense, but stories I think exist in every game that's been even briefly mentioned today.
Yeah, I think, is this actually on?
No.
Oh, yeah.
It's pretend on.
It's a mini switch.
Give her yours and then turn hers on while she's
Thank you. So for the story that I was sort of giving preview of, I'll spoil the premise slightly further in order to talk about what I'm doing with it. The character that you start out as is a very particular person, but my process is really about sort of we've got somebody specific to start with, but then we're going to put him in a situation where he's going to have to change in some way, and the way in which he changes is going to be up to the player. So what happens, in fact, after your employer sends you off to this oracle to consult it and say, can my boss in fact become the emperor, and you're kind of nervous about how this is going to go, the oracle comes back and says, no, you are. And so then you're in this situation where you have to decide what you are going to do with that information, what you even think that information means to you. Do you believe that there are gods that send this message? Do you believe that the priests are messing with you? Like, what do you think is going on? What are you going to do about that? And so at the simulation level and the mechanical level, a lot of what is being simulated for the characters, it has been chosen to be about things that are thematically relevant to that situation. Like, are you a menacing person? Are you a person who is able to convey being high status? Are you going to be able to like learn to dominate the people around you sufficiently that you could have a path to power that way? Are you going to be a very loyal person and try to stick with and support the people with whom you've formed relationships and try and make things work out in that way? And there is a certain amount of challenge in the structure of it, because there are many, many ways to have things go fatally wrong. So it's possible to lose in that sense. But what I really think of as being the essential of the gameplay is about this sort of process of, all right, I am a specific character, but I'm in that character in a situation that is so like metamorphic amounts of pressure are being applied, and anybody who's in that situation would have to change in some significant way. And so then the question for the player is like, which of these changes are you going to adopt in order to survive, and are you going to be able to wield those methods effectively?
I have a question for you.
Yes.
My question is, do you find that the breadth of options, because you literally, like, you can do anything you want because it's text, right? Like, you can write.
Yes, text is all powerful.
Yeah, it's true though. Do you find that the breadth of options you're able to offer the player has the potential to stunt you thematically though? Like,
so there's a very
thematically, like in a narrative, like in a traditional story sense, not necessarily in the way like Soren would use it.
Right. No, I know what you mean. No, it's possible to give the player choices that would not be interesting. And so I try to be pretty rigorous about, like, I do not at any point give the character the opportunity to just decide to like leave Rome and like try to move to Britain or something. Because while somebody might theoretically attempt that in that situation, and it might even be a reasonable thing to try, that takes them out of the story space and therefore is not interesting. And I'm most interested in, like, what are things that I could let the player do for which there would be some consequence that would, what is a justifiable disaster that I could make happen to you as a result of your doing this? And if there's a good answer to that question, whether it's like, you could do this but it breaks your relationship with somebody, or you could do this but it destroys such and such, like, that means that there's enough narrative juice behind that choice to make it available to the player and make that worthwhile.
Cool.
Mind you, that I asked them about writing, and they kept talking about actions and characters, because writing is that. It's not like writing the dialogue alone.
That's the easy part. Sorry,
Yeah.
like putting the words where they go is like the simplest part. That's just like you know the words because you speak the languages. Go where they go. Like, it's the other part that's the hard part. The design is like the writing part. Like once it actually gets down to like writing like the certain way a guy speaks or whatever, like you just go back to your ability to do that and pull out that skill set and do it. But it's everything else that's the hard part. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you.
No. That's the writing. So that's like the solved problem. But you actually, both of you were talking about narrative design. That's exactly narrative design. Yay!
Like if this was an art talk, you wouldn't, it's like you wouldn't get. I think it's so funny because writing is one of those things everybody does every day. You write your name, you write your thing. You're writing an email right now. You're probably tweeting about this. This guy won't shut up. But like because everybody does it, it's like it becomes. The actual placement, like the actual use of the words becomes a thing, but like you wouldn't talk to an artist about unless you were at like a very, very specific like workshop about how they're moving the brush, or how they're like, what setting they're using on their Wacom. It's like the same thing to me, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. So it's more about you design, like the writing happens the moment you start designing the game, the same way marketing happens the moment you start designing the game if you're making a commercial game. All that stuff is... When you're going from nothing to something, it's all happening right then. And you just have to be really cognizant of that.
I think it was Soren Johnson who said this morning that he felt that the games that he worked on were very different from other types of games. And it's true that we have like little universes. Someone who works in adventure games, at times coming to practice is a reminder of what other people do in games. But like it also sounds kind of like foreign to me. It helps me understand games I play, but not the games I make most of the time. Excuse me, I want you to respond to any of the issues this morning. Like, how do you feel that what you do is actually different, or like anything that has been raised this morning that you feel, hey, no, this is not how I make games, or yes, I agree with this. Like, this is more. There's a similarity between what I do and what has been mentioned in the sessions before this.
First, I just did a really good thing in the talk. Sorry, I was gonna give you props later, but I'll do it now in front of everybody. The thing you said about Dishonored and stuff, I thought was good.
Oh, okay. I was gonna say that I'm just obsessed with a Walking Dead DLC that replaces Lee with Zimmerman.
Good. No, but
I got nothing else.
I thought you made a good point. Just about player expression. Even though you're in a linear corridor, you end up feeling emotionally the same way as if you were sneaking around in Dishonored with a very like large systemic palette of abilities, with a world that's going to respond to them in a systemic way.
I think that the things that the game cares about are very, very different. I mean, Walking Dead. I mean, Warren, when you were talking this morning, you specifically said you don't care why or how something happens. It's just you've given players the opportunity to choose for themselves why and how an objective is reached. Whereas The Walking Dead, I think, is only concerned with why and how, and not with what, because the what
is the same.
Is the prescribed piece for everyone. But the whole deal with The Walking Dead is entirely everyone is going through what is on the surface the same experience, but what that means to them is hopefully a little bit different for different people. And some of the lack of breadth or presence of breadth is determined by budget, and some of it is prescribed by the specific person that we put you inside of, and some of it is prescribed by us just thinking of the story that we thought of. But hopefully the space that is available inside of that is something that players feel like they have ownership over in a way that maybe they don't in a straight up LucasArts or Sierra vintage graphic adventure game.
Yeah, and I think like one thing coming out of that is like the thing that's always really cool to me is at the end of the game, there's a choice you make at the end of the game that is sort of the definitive or the last one. But I always ask people why they made that one, and that's the most interesting thing to me. Like, I wish there was like a whole nother. I wish there was a thing.
Like, I
wish there was like a whole nother moment of the game where you had to like write us a letter or something, because like you ask 1,000 people like, what did you do with Lee there at the end, or what did you have Clementine do at the end, and everybody's reasoning for doing it is different, and that's the thing that I think is cool. Like that's the thing that I'm the most concerned about when it comes to game design, in that sense. And when it comes to like, you know, like explicit narrative versus emergent simulation, like honestly, I don't care. Like I just really don't care. The only thing I'm really concerned about is trying to get an emotional reaction out of a person. And when I play Far Cry 2,
you just like electrocute them.
What was it? Yeah, or if I
electrocute,
yeah,
poke them.
Yeah, like if I play Far Cry 2, there's some moments that have happened completely systemically in that game that were really emotionally impactful. But it's not just the systems. Like so much of it is the creative design of that game. So much of it is how dreadful like the milieu is of like mercenaries in Africa and these like warring factions where you know it's never going to be good here. There's no happy ending to this game. Like, so much of that is the creative design. So when the systems come into play, I actually feel something. Like when my like companion gets killed because we make a mistake and a bunch of guys jump us in the street, and that's completely systemic driven. Like, I have an emotional reaction. So
that's also not just the creative content. It's also just the decision to put companions in the game and to make companions have XYZ properties.
Right, but I'm saying, like, you could put that exact same system, and this is not to crap on Far Cry 3, but you could put that exact same system in Far Cry 3, and I think the tone of the creative design of that game would not support the emotional impact.
Well, your companion would show up and probably like just give you a tattoo.
Yes.
Sorry.
And no, that was snarky. That was nice. Yeah, so I don't really care about the debate so much as I do the conversation around getting an emotional response out of a person that is sincere. Like, the sincerity debate is more interesting to me, to be honest.
If I can kind of build on that a little bit, one of the things that I was going to say during my actual talk, but I got cut for time, was that the narrative context is hugely important in what we're doing. And you might think, oh, well, you've got the simulator that makes people run around. Like, why don't you just turn up all of the reactions to everything to 11 and like let them punch each other in the face all the time and like forget about having scenes and just see what happens? And the answer is, well, number one, like what happens is after a while they kind of run out of exciting new things to do to each other, and you've seen the whole repertoire of face punching. But number two, like it just the amount that the player actually cares about that when there is no constructed context around it is not really that satisfying. And I have much more, I mean, this is speaking personally at this point, but I have much more satisfaction out of scenes in which I have the opportunity to do something small, like insulting somebody that I secretly don't like very much, or taking somebody's hand, or clapping somebody on the back, and having this sort of moment of a small gesture of human connection inserted into that scene. If everything else that's going on around it, it makes that feel really important. That to me is more powerful than a simulated experience in which like things have gone all completely crazy, but there was no sort of introductory reason for me to care about what happened. Like, there are no stakes to the scene, we have no interpersonal history, there's therefore like whatever happens between us is a completely erasable event and doesn't matter. Whereas if you put that in the context of, you know, here are high stakes situations where people are making judgments about each other, and there's physical jeopardy or romantic jeopardy, or you know, you've got a long history together, or I as the player have started to totally hate this person and I want him to eat human leg, that makes a huge difference to how effective the simulation is. The other thing I wanted to say about sort of working with simulation in a narrative context is that it's good if the simulation is surprising. It's not good if it's surprisingly surprising. So like the second derivative needs to be 0, if that makes sense. Or anyway, don't. But the point is like it's wonderful when things happen, like characters get annoyed at one another in a scene, and so they use a prop that's been defined to be able to do all sorts of things. And I had one sort of demo scene that I was working on where the setup was that these two characters were walking in a park, and one of the characters happened to be a guy who was just a very sort of annoying, pugnacious guy who would pick on people because that was what he liked to do. So he started picking on somebody, and then they got annoyed with him, and then he pushed the person in the lake. And there was no pushing somebody in a lake thing scripted into that, but the setting involved a body of water. Bodies of water knew that if, you know, an aggressive thing that you could do to somebody would be to push them into the lake. So that was all, like, that was, to me, a satisfying level of emergence for that scene to go there, but it wasn't broken. But you sort of, the trick of figuring out how to shape the boundaries around the simulation so that cool and interesting things will happen but not actually break it is really important. And I think it is worth not breaking it, because I think it is important to keep that narrative commitment to what's going on to make the rest of it feel valuable.
Right. You want to say something?
Nah.
Okay. All right. Time for questions from the audience. Okay. Wow, we have a lot. Okay, Warren.
Okay, so I have about 14 things to say. Do you want a mic? I have a mic? No, that's all right. Just checking. Shouting it out. Okay. So
Are you going to do that right now?
No, I care very deeply about why players do things, and I care very deeply, and I hope my games express that the world needs to notice and respond to the actions. It's not just about physics, it's not just about objects, it's about characters noticing and responding appropriately to how you're interacting with them and with the world. And this didn't have time to talk about all this stuff, so that just to address that.
All right.
Okay, so and I have a comment and a question about Walking Dead, which I genuinely thought was a genius piece of work.
I don't G word. Don't use the G
No,
word.
there were two things specifically that I thought.
Sarcasm said the genius.
One, I want to comment on it. You talk about inhabiting, being in Lee's skin, and I felt like I was constrained appropriately by being in Lee's skin. But the most powerful moments and the ones that made me really feel the emotion that I think you wanted to across were the ones where the choices were more about me than they were about Lee. Where I was expressing what I was as a human being, not what I thought this puppet should do on the screen because it was cool for the story, or because it's what Lee was able to do, I would say. And I thought that was really, really powerful. The question I have is the other genius thing that I've been trying to figure out how to get into my own work is you guys basically eliminated skill from the choice and consequences of it.
That's because we don't have a ton of skill. So if you can't get past level 1 of your own game, you. Yeah.
It just killed me. And the places where I thought, Eric, this is for you. The places where I thought Walking Dead failed were the ones where you did try to introduce a skill element. I mean, like that crawling up the stairs, shooting a shotgun.
Oh yeah, I agree.
Did you ever talk about just get rid of all the skills?
Every single day.
I think the game would have actually been better.
Probably.
Yeah,
I don't know what to tell you other than I completely agree.
I think it was specifically hard on The Walking Dead because it's a game that is still it's a game based on an IP where zombies chase you and you have to shoot them at some point. And when you have an Xbox controller in your hand, it's hard to make that feel get you all amped up to shoot a guy if there isn't a stupid target that you have to put on a guy, and if you don't, he's going to chomp you.
And also, it's just honestly, there's no. If you look at just from a critical studies standpoint, I completely agree. Looking at the text of the thing, and I think we felt that way all the way through production. We could imagine what the game was going to be like with this action sequences in them, and we're dissatisfied, but they are the way they are. But in the context of actually having to develop the game, we were developing the game at Telltale right after while Jurassic Park was being made. And then Jurassic Park came out with this radical idea of no walking around and you're going to jump between all these characters, and people hated it. People absolutely hated it. And then, the heads of the studio turned to us and are like, so what radical shit are you guys doing? And at that stage, we had a very radical prototype. And it was well, we don't really want to do this, we don't want to do that, and we're going to take this off screen. And then the idea of introducing a zombie game where you weren't going to shoot anything or you weren't going to do whatever was horrifying because a giant creative risk had just been made and didn't work out. So there's a little bit of audience expectation. We live in a post-Walking Dead world now where it's we didn't need to. There's no zombies in large chunks of it, and we were around for the DLC. We worked on the DLC a little bit as just sort of. I think we wrote some story pitches. I wrote one of the chapters. That was it. But we went to all the meetings and. In the DLC, at one point there were no zombies in the DLC, and people had just forgotten. Nobody noticed that there were no zombies until our head of worldwide marketing was why aren't there any goddamn zombies in the DLC? Oh no! With hindsight, you take a lot of that stuff out, but the audience at the same time is expecting a zombie game. Yeah, they're probably Oh, sorry, it's not my job to pick. Sorry.
We have Rob over there. Yeah. Oh, David. Sorry. I was
I was wondering what you thought of choices in games where they're not so much about what the characters do, but about what you want the story to do. Recently, Kentucky Route Zero has these scenes where your character falls and you choose whether they broke their leg or not, which is a very different thing where you're choosing the consequence of an action that's served up to you, as opposed to choosing an action that's based on the consequence.
For me personally, it always ends up feeling way more intellectual and less emotional.
Yeah, I was gonna say something.
It just your brain immediately, one's brain, my brain immediately just goes to thinking about structure and thinking about sort of cascading out possibilities, and it puts the notion of the choice that you're making way more back into the school of what is the outcome of this choice, what is the outcome of my choice going to mean, whereas I think the really emotional context, sort of like suspension of disbeliefy Walking Dead stuff, is way more focused on the exact second at which the choice is being made. Like, we're talking about most of the choices in The Walking Dead, the actual repercussions are bullshit. Like, they are totally like this effectively content-wise the same outcome happens, but that's because the importance is on the moment and what the moment means, whereas the moment you start introducing form into the choice, I think it immediately is deflated emotionally. And that's not to say that Kentucky Route Zero doesn't have emotional stuff in it, but those moments didn't really do it for me in the same way. They're interesting, but not. It's the thing that you say, "Ah, cool," instead of the thing that you say, "Oh, fuck." I don't know. Anyone else want to talk about that?
I think that can be quite interesting, but yeah, I would agree it's a less visceral kind of experience. But there have been actually some experiments back in that before. I mean, like Witch's Yarn, which I don't know if anybody has run into, but it is an indie game by Mouse Chief from some years back, had this interesting mechanic where you were not playing any of the characters. What you could do was trigger which character was going to walk into the scene next. And that allowed you to be this sort of puppeteer or playmaster and control who was going to get involved. But it did kind of engage you in in sort of speculation about what would be dramatically interesting. I wonder what would happen if this character found this out right now. And that, I found that very playful and very enjoyable in a completely different way. But it was quite cool.
All right, we have Ben, that back there.
So this is actually a little bit related to what you were saying earlier about breaking your leg or not. But one of the things that I thought was one of the things that I really wanted in Walking Dead and was a little bit frustrated by was this sense of character backstory and choosing whether things were true or whether I was lying about them was always sort of left ambiguous. And I can understand from a production standpoint maybe why that would be, but I was wondering if you guys maybe had thoughts about the nature of whether player choices about things off screen being becoming true because the player says they happen versus everything just kind of ambiguous up in the air.
Yeah, actually, can I talk about that? Because I'm going to spoil something about our game.
That's fine.
Yeah, so we talked about that a lot. We actually got to the point where we said at the very beginning, the answers you make are going to write his backstory.
No, we didn't.
We talked about that.
Oh, we talked about it. It's not how we decided. Okay.
Yeah, I know it's in the actual game.
Okay, I'm really confused. Sorry.
We talked about that, though, sitting in that back room. Yeah, Telltale. And it just, for some reason, I can't remember what our exact outcome of that was, but Lee has a concrete backstory, and you can get him to just lay it out in that scene.
In the last scene of the game.
You can get him to do it. It is a choice where you can walk him to the point where he just says, this is exactly what happened. So he has a concrete backstory, but I wanted... a lot of it was learning along the way, to be honest. I got to tell you, there was no sort of super there wasn't an academic hypothesis with an ideological reason for making the choices. It was let's see how people react. So we explored that. You would make choices in dialogue that would retroactively write his backstory, and it felt sort of chintzy, I guess, in practice. It just felt sort of. It brought in the idea of metaphysics. It made it feel very
Also, I think in the case of The
spiritual.
Walking Dead, it kind of violated a main theme of the game. That's the reason we decided on is one of the things about The Walking Dead. The stupid slogan in a movie trailer would probably just be "You can't change your past." So if there's literally a dialogue where you can be like, "I didn't kill that guy," and then the game just goes, "You did not kill him," that would be just the opposite of this particular game. But I think that's. Anyway.
Yeah, and I think so much of the story is about guilt and about Lee's particular baggage and his emotional state. So the things that happened to him before the game started needed to have happened very concretely for him to be the character that we wanted to explore.
That's not to say the execution made it fulfilling.
No, I think the execution would probably do differently. And that's why, we're talking about that in our the game we're working on right now. We haven't said a word about what game we're working on right now, so this is the first words anybody on Earth has heard. So, you're playing as a central character, like a main protagonist, with a very very detailed backstory. And the problem we're trying to solve right now is the moment you start talking to another person in this game, you're going to be forging a relationship with them.
So what if you start with amnesia?
Oh my God, we have to go. So it would be like, for instance, I'm not saying this is what it is, but for instance, if you're a male character and we introduce you to a female character and she says something to you that makes you laugh, and then you say something to her that makes her laugh, and then the dialogue continues, and you sort of get an option to be a little flirty with her. And you say, whatever, you say something flirty. I can't write on the spot. And then later, you find out that your character is married or divorced or whatever. That conversation now is a completely different meaning that you didn't have any context for when you were having it. But we want to start the game with character interaction. So we're talking about how do we get you into that backstory place without just showing you a cutscene. I think we have a solution to it, but I'm not going to share that. But we're going to try to solve that problem in this game, very concretely up front.
Concretely for us, we're not going to offer. It's not like a definitive solution. This is our games will start from now on.
We might not even ship this thing. We might fail. So who knows?
No one will play this game.
No. But that's actually the first problem we're trying to solve right now. We have a solution for it that I think is interesting. Maybe we'll talk about privately. But yeah. So that's a good question.
One with way at the back.
Hey, so when I played The Walking Dead, I felt a lot like I was watching a drama show, and that I was faced with the problems that fans of television are known to face, where you grow attached to characters, you want the catharsis of seeing conflicts resolved, but that doesn't actually make for good TV. The writers have to keep introducing conflicts, even as characters that they're mad at each other the next day because that's wrong. And playing The Walking Dead, I at least got to decide at what time certain characters were going to hate each other. And I thought that was really interesting. That was like a really cool way to feel like I had choice in my narrative. I can't decide whether or not we're leaving this place right now, but I can decide that these guys get along right now and these guys don't. That's who I care about right now. And this might especially be a question for Emily, but I'm curious to hear if you guys have thoughts on this from developing. That's like a narrative structure thing that I feel like players would rail against, right? If you're asking a player to construct a story, they're going to want things to end up nice and tidy because that's human nature. But then they're going to be disappointed with the story that they just did for themselves. How do you enable people to tell stories that have a compelling amount of conflict in them, even though you naturally want to resolve that?
I think in The Walking Dead, the way that we did that was by moment to moment telling everyone that they did something that was okay and right, even if they thought to themselves that it was bad, which is kind of shitty if you think about it. I mean, it kind of sucks that you have to tell people that are playing a game you're doing the right thing every single time, even when they are chopping off someone's head. It's like a character always walks up and is like, you know what? I would have done the same thing. And I think it's what keeps people moving forward and keeps them from erasing their save game. And I think that at the end of the day, it makes them, for the people for whom that created a suspension of disbelief, which is, I think, a weird other topic to talk about. I think they can get to the end of this thing and say, you know what, I didn't get everything that I wanted, but I did everything that I could. And that was the feeling that we hoped we could get people to at the end of The Walking Dead. And when it didn't work, they were like, this game is fucking bullshit, not game. But, which is fine. It's not. But that, I think, was kind of what we tried to do on The Walking Dead, which was, I don't know. Is that
yeah.
Other people talk besides me. I gotta go.
So my answer for that, at least on the projects that I'm working on at the moment, is heavily inspired by playing a bunch of tabletop story games, and particularly the sort of roles that you get into with other players where in things like Polaris or Shock, where the other player is playing as your antagonist, and it's their job to not block you in the improv sense. Like, they're not saying, no, that doesn't happen. They're saying, yes, that does happen, but something else is the consequence of that as well. And so I've tried to import that basic design concept into the consequences of choices in this story that I'm working on at the moment, where you do something because you want to be loyal to somebody, or because you want to save somebody's life, or because you want to save your own skin, or because you are trying to gain power or whatever. And what I do is not say, oh, that failed most of the time. I mean, it's possible to get in, like, it's possible to get yourself killed if you're determined to do so, but I try for the most part not to do, like, oh, that's just blocked, you failed. But you did achieve what you were trying to do. It's just that also had another consequence that came out of it. So, like, I told this character the truth about something because I wanted to demonstrate that I was loyal to them and become better friends with them, and that did have that effect of strengthening our relationship. But a consequence of that is that then, now that they know the truth, they did something destructive to somebody else, or they did something foolish themselves and got hurt, or whatever. You know, it's sort of that yes, you did this, and in exchange, this other thing is going to come out of it, which then feels like, you know, it's not just the game sort of arbitrarily throwing stuff at you. It's like, well, you know, you chose to pursue something, and then there is a trade-off to that.
Yeah, and we take a lot of flack. Like, I mean, obviously, it's a polarizing game. I'm sure there are a lot of people in here who actually don't like it. Like, when people say, like, oh, my choice didn't matter, that can sometimes get back to that issue of, like, it's mainly because we couldn't, if we wrap up the character conflict here, like, this thing's like, it's not a good story. Like, everybody got in a big fight but sorted it out and was happy in the end. Like, nobody wants to hear that story, you know? Like, it's the worst story ever. You know, something that's like an anecdote that was sort of interesting is, and I think helps, well, first off, at any moment you have to be very aware of what's going on. There's got to be some good stuff happening and some, like, not so good stuff happening. Because if you overburden the player with a bunch of bad stuff, they're gonna get too tired. But Larry, the guy we fed human meat to right there, he in the first episode he's just the worst. He's just a total a-hole. And then at the beginning of the second episode, still an a-hole. But we have this little, like, thought experiment there where you're given 4 pieces of food and have 9 people to feed. Or 8 people to feed. 9, I think, including Lee. And the metrics on that weren't published on the back end of the game like a lot of the choices are. But we showed this slide in our GDC talk. But the way it broke down is something like 90% of players give Clementine a piece of food. 88% of players give the other little kid, Duck, a piece of food. Then there's like 45% of players give this new character, Mark, who's nobody's ever seen before. You're in the opening scene with him, a piece of food. And then the third character, who isn't a kid or brand new, is Larry. And then it's everybody else, like Carly, Doug, everybody, blah, 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 blah. But, like, so if it's not a kid, you can go ahead and say, okay, kids are off the table because, like, everybody's going to feed the kids. But Larry's the first character, the first adult character from the previous episode who people try to feed. And it's because people want him to like them. It's amazing. He's a racist. Like, it's insanity. And it's just like it's the numbers. And I think like in a non-systemic game, players building those goals in for themselves and then just giving them the smallest system of, like, literally, like, put this token in one of these, like, boxes is really, really ended up being a really powerful game design tool for us. And it kept people going with him because they were working on something with him. And I think that produces a story, you know, for the character. Like, I'm going to get that guy to like me. And then they, as Lee, are on that mission, even though the game didn't say that. I think it would have been very, very bad if they said, now get him to like you. You know, like, that would have been pretty awful. So.
Right. Last couple of questions. Naomi, and then that will be the last one.
So I'm curious about the players who complain about, like, okay, that choice didn't matter, that wasn't the real choice. So, like, which came up a lot, I think I remember seeing was, like, okay, it doesn't matter whether I choose to say Carly or Doug, they both end up dying.
it's worth pointing out that that does absolutely not exist. There are no sliders underneath that game at all. There's no points. It's stupid.
Well, there are outcomes. So hold on. No, shut up.
There's outcomes, but
I mean,
you can't
all the
grind
stuff
character affinity and stuff though.
Yeah, you can.
What?
Not systemically the way Mass Effect does it, but you can definitely make a certain amount of choices with a certain character that makes them say something nice to you later.
Yeah, that's true.
It's the exact same thing a slider would do. Yeah.
The real outcome is like when who comes with you in the final chapter, right? Like that's when you
Right.
decide, like, did I like properly beat the game because I got everybody to come with me? That means like I maxed out all my passive possible relationships.
I think you have to be a liar to do that, actually, which is funny to me. You know what I mean? It's interesting to me. So.
So I guess my question is, so you guys have a ton of these, like I think what Emily before has called reflective choices, or they call expressive choices, that are more about like your interiority as a player, like how you feel about it. And there is this whole class of players who are like, those don't exist for me. They're not even in my sights as being an actual choice that I'm making. And so to you guys, from your point of view as the creators, is that one valid way of approaching the game, or is that sort of like not really playing the game?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely valid. I mean, people can approach it however they want to approach it. I think it's not up to us. I think it's designed to be a game where you aren't supposed to worry about the systems happening underneath it or winning or losing. Like, just yes and. That's the design, ideology behind it, is just make a choice and move on. Because it's kind of the way life works. So it's always weird to me when people say, like, my choice between Doug and Carly didn't matter. It's like, you were around this other person for, 3 episodes who shared personal stuff about themselves with you that you then got to reflect upon. Like, you got to build a romantic relationship with one of them, maybe. And then that person was taken away from you. Your totally chose, that was a totally different story. I don't know. When Doug goes out, it's so depressing to me because all that guy wanted to be was helpful and couldn't really find his way to be helpful. It was just sort of this really dour story, and I don't know. He's just left on the side of the road. So I don't know. I don't really know what to say to that player, but it's a completely valid criticism. It just means the game's probably not for you. I don't know. Does that seem right?
Yeah, I always think of the big choice stuff in The Walking Dead, or as the season went on, I sort of started thinking about them as basically the boss battle to the encounter that was the previous scenario. In the 3rd episode, there's a big, huge thing in the middle where Lily, one of the women who's with you, ends up just blowing away that person that you save, which kills that storyline. But at the end of that, it's true. Everyone does see the exact same scene. Lily shoots someone in the face, and then the game moves on. But to me, that Lily shooting someone in the face, I think in sort of a lot of ways you look at choice, is the beginning of something new, whereas the way that I think we end up seeing it is that is the end of something old. The level, the video game level of Lily suspects that there's a spy and it's maybe someone that you like. How do you deal with the situation? The final confrontation is that. And then effectively, and probably literally, a load screen comes up, and then the board is now reset to Lily has just blown someone away. What do you do until the next big choice, which is effectively a stupid narrative boss battle? And then, as far as amped upness goes, and I think I thought a lot when we were putting together our GDC talk about this stuff, how you could have both. And I think that the way to do that is not inside of my brain. How do you make the lead up work in that way and then also have the payoff work in that way? How do you get the specificity of context and of story that you get out of basically just a bespoke flowchart like The Walking Dead, or which is basically the world's most expensive Twine game with QTEs, I think. And then also have the ripple out that you get from a crazily systemically driven game where everything can bounce off each other, and you're obviously trying to do that, which is fucking terrifying to me. But
well, the script for the thing that I'm working on right now is over 150,000 words, and that's
sweet.
So you have
words.
Sorry. Well, I mean, it is. Well, okay, never mind. The point is that represents multiple novels, or short novels worth of content, and much of that you would not run into in a single playthrough, and that's the cost of doing that.
Interesting. I have questions.
Yeah, to me there's a bit of a strange omission in discussion about narrative. It seems that all of discussion is either around simulation-style games or narrativistic games.
Please talk about cart life.
Or a single thing. Yeah. That's the only thing that we've heard, both before Inspector and you guys, who's solely concentrating on single player. Do you have any thoughts on how to create systems for player-to-player?
Yeah, I was actually.
Let's just put it on the table that's still an actual.
No. So like, I only really play multiplayer games. Like, I don't really play games that aren't multiplayer for some reason. This is where my life is right now. It's like Dota and Minecraft. It's pretty much it. But Minecraft has been the one that's been left out, and like that is the most like bare bone. Like that is when we talk about systemic emergent games, right? And I really loved Dishonored, but like it still starts with a movie, and there's multiple movies inside of it. But like Minecraft feels like the purest version of that, where it's like it's just the system and other people who are complex creature systems on the other side of a terminal, and the stories that emerge in Minecraft are really, really, really amazing. I got a lot of that playing DayZ as well, and I would love, again, I think like Soren was saying, like I don't know how to make that game sort of thing. I would love to be able to be in a spot in my life where I could make a game like that. It's not like I don't have the technical proficiency to be valuable on a team like that, to be honest. But I think when I talk about, when people start talking about emergent games, like Minecraft is like the first place that I go as part of that conversation. And I think they're incredibly narrative and very, very story driven, which is why I was trying to kind of make the delineation at the beginning between our little tiny corner of the design world, which is exploring a single character in a story. Like there are stories that exist that don't have any characters in them. Like, you don't need characters to have a story. Or you don't need specific characters to have a story. You can have metaphor and object, and like you can read like Calvino's Cosmic Comics, and it's just like things floating in space or colliding, and it's a narrative.
We also talked about sort of splitting the difference on that. Like we sort of postulated the hypothetical situation that everyone who was playing as Lee secretly existed inside of the Walking Dead multiverse, and like what if a just door of light opened in everyone's game, and when you walked your Lee out, you would just sit next to someone else's Lee, and you both could dialogue with each other, but blood started coming out of our ears before we really
Oh
figured
God!
out.
No, when were we talking about that? We were talking about
that on Secret Thing. We can't talk about that. Okay.
Oh my God! No, we were doing some contract work, like in between leaving Telltale and starting Campo Santo, and it wasn't a project that was going to go anywhere because it was maybe going to be Campo Santo's first project. Doesn't really matter, and that idea came out, and something I'm really interested in, big time, but. Yeah, I think we did sort of talk our way into that multiverse. Like, no, you're playing this game, but you're actually playing that game inside of somebody else's game. And then bloods again started to seep out of our ears and our noses, and we decided to make the game we're making now.
Yeah. So for Versu, actually, the underlying engine is capable of multiplayer because it is agnostic, essentially, about which characters need to be driven by AI and which characters need to be driven by players. And our early versions of that were multiplayer, and we did do a certain amount of sort of experiment of what is it like to do this. And we found that there were sort of syncing up issues, but if you managed to be like playing on your iPad and then somebody else was playing on their iPad or whatever, it made a lot of the sort of in passing moments a lot funnier because you knew that it wasn't just an AI insulting you, it was your friend had selected, right, exactly, like your friend had actually selected to do something insulting to you, and that just like made it somehow more entertaining. But a reasonable question is, why doesn't it do that now? And the answer is, well, various business reasons, but it's not inconceivable down the line. And I think what the gameplay, I think the direction you kind of have to go with gameplay for something that is very narrative heavy but is also multiplayer, is to kind of take as many lessons as you possibly can get out of role-playing games and out of I assume that's why you asked the question, right? But yeah, I mean, that's a big inspiration for me, and also sort of taking the lead of improv also, of like, let's give these people some tool sets by which they can sort of evolve a communication with one another that feels meaningful in this moment. Let's let them play this moment out, and then have some way of agreeing that the scene ends and transitions to something else. So I think there is possibility there. It just happens to be down a slightly different evolutionary path than we're actually pursuing at the moment. But I think it's possible and would be cool, and I would love to see more work done on it.
All right. Well, that was the last question. But if you want to ask any questions to our speakers, they'll be around, right? You're not running away?
No.
No?
Thank you for being a room full of terrifyingly smart people.
Thanks, everybody.